This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today I'm excited to welcome Mr. Mike Favetta to the show. Now, Mr. Favetta is a meteorologist and the owner of WeatherPrep LLC, a meteorology consulting firm. In addition to meteorology, his expertise spans climatology and the environment. Mr. Favetta has over 13 years of expert witness experience and holds a bachelor's in Atmospheric Sciences and Meteorology from Keane University. Mr. Favetta, thank you so much for joining me here today at the Roundtable.
Thanks so much, Noah. Great to be here.
Let's jump into it. You've had an impressive career as a meteorologist, including a 16-year stint in broadcast. How did you first get into expert witnessing?
So, being the public figure in the local news sense, a lot of attorneys would call the station, say, hey, I need a quick update, need a quick report. Can you look up the weather on this date? Was there ice at this intersection? I'm representing a client. And so, the phone call would initially come to the assignment desk, which is like the heart of the newsroom. And then either a manager will intercede and say, whoa, put the brakes on. Our meteorologist can't give away free weather information. There's legal issues. And so I noticed that becoming more of a trend. And, I come from a family of judges and attorneys. And so without me professionally being, and formally educated in the legal space, there was a lot of interest all along. And I was also kind of, shying away after those 15 years of waking up at 2:30 in the morning to get to the studio at 4 a.m. because that kind of grows old really fast. And so entering the fun space of challenging my brain of figuring out these forensic meteorology cases was really exciting. And so that's how I kind of entered into it from the basic need and necessity of the clients that were potentially out there.
When you got that first call, is it something that you had been seeking, or did it just come out of the blue? Did somebody show you the ropes? Did you have any mentoring?
And that's the funny part. It's so rare to have another colleague in the meteorology world, hold your hand and walk you through and say, here's how to get to the next step. For instance, certification. So there's a credential that meteorologists can apply for called the Certified Consulting Meteorology Seal. It's a 2-year process. It is really long and really hard. But one of the first things that you need, and something that delayed me a few years, was recommendations from 3 other CCMs, or certified consulting meteorologists. And when you get into this world, it's really hard to look away because it's so lucrative, it's fun, it's exciting. And I could see now why other meteorologists and colleagues of mine did not want me to enter the space, didn't want to give me that little boost, because it's a fun, closed network, but it's also challenging to break into. So a lot of the initial kind of forays I had into the space was trying to advertise, trying to get my name out there. And even asking some of the family members who, had their own law firms, like, hey, how do I get in this space? How do I, represent and become an expert witness? And they're like, Michael, it's all about referrals. You can't advertise. You can't, just show up and say, hey, do you want to pay me a couple $100 an hour to work on this case for you? That's not the way it works. So over the course of time, it was the referrals from other attorneys that I've worked with that saw my work, were so impressed by the detail and how much it helped them in their cases, that once I finished working with them, or even had the initial phone call, I got 3 other phone calls from other attorneys in that same firm because word got out that, hey, this guy's really good. And so that was really exciting to broaden my network organically without spending a lot of time or money on advertising, and just through word of mouth references.
When you were very first getting into it, before you had, a lot of things like references, tell me about some of those first vetting calls. What are the sorts of questions that attorneys are asking a potential expert witness, and what's your calculus for deciding whether or not you're going to accept an engagement?
So I think a lot of it relates to ability. You have to know your limits. And one of the precedents for obtaining that certified consulting meteorology seal is only staying within your own limits as terms of your expertise. Don't try to guess. Don't try to theorize as to what it could be, and seek out the help of another expert meteorologist in that specific field, should it come to that. Because staying in your lane is probably the most important thing, I've been told from attorneys that want me to stay credible and remain credible and only give the facts to the case. And I think that initially was kind of a challenge for me in the very beginning, was knowing fact versus expert opinion, because there's a little bit of a fine line as to what the facts were or what the expert is opining on and what could be fact. So that took a little bit of a learning curve for me when I was starting out.
When you're talking about staying in your proverbial lane, let's talk about what exactly that lane is.
So I would say that about 90% of my cases in the last 5 years have been slip and falls on ice. It's been personal injury where there have been melting and refreeze scenarios. And it's my job to, yes, any attorney can go and get the blue ribbon sealed certified data from NOAA or NCEI, or formerly NCDC, to find what the weather was at a nearby airport at a certain time. But that just gives you total inches of snow, doesn't necessarily represent ice, doesn't represent the melt and refreeze at a certain location, for instance, a parking lot. And a lot of the cases recently have been so localized that the nearby airports, at least, I'm in the New York City metro area. We have 3 main airports plus a few smaller municipal airports, and they have really good weather stations and really good data. But if there's a small snow squall that hits over just Brooklyn, population in the millions, that does not pass over an airport, you could have a slip and fall scenario just a few miles away from JFK Airport, for instance, without the airport weather station ever finding snow that day. So I found some really interesting techniques that I've used and developed those over the last few years that have really helped the attorneys that I work with kind of hone in and help defend, or on the other side, as I could postulate for the plaintiff, just kind of give them that extra information to see if they want to, go in a particular direction with their case. So I've kind of fine-tuned that over the last few years, developing a product that is in a report form, affordable, but also quite helpful to the hiring party.
When you say you've developed some techniques that kind of aid the way that you go about expert witnessing, can you be more specific? Can you share any of what those techniques are?
Sure. So some of them relate to different networks of weather stations, while there are some of the National Weather Service owned and operated weather stations at the big airports. There are newer technologies such as local weather stations. They're called the Mesonet. And so they are run by the University of Albany and they're funded by New York State. And these weather stations have the same capability, if not an even better capability than some of the weather service stations, because they're not meant for aviation purposes. They're not meant for the long-term climate purposes. They're focused on what's happening at this location just a few blocks away from where a potential location or premises could be where the accident took place. And so that is very helpful to get a fine resolution, minute by minute analysis of what's happening nearby. There's also remote sensing techniques. So we talked about the in situ, which are, the locations on the ground and the weather stations that are nearby. But there's also really powerful weather radar that can give you an idea of what happened high above our heads. And so 5,000 feet up, if the radar detected some snow, and that snow made it to the ground for the course of several hours without actually hitting a weather station, you can provide that data and show some concrete evidence that there was precipitation that was frozen at a particular location. I've even used some solar angles and 3D renderings to simulate the shadow cast of a tall building. It was this 20-story housing complex in New Jersey, and there was an ice case on the shadowy side of that building in the wintertime when the sun angle is low. So calculating the sun angle and showing that, in graphic form in a report, I think was really exciting. And it really opened the eyes to the attorney that, wow, there's a lot of different ways that this could be used. It's almost like CSI weather. It's a lot of fun.
I imagine that most of the time, nobody who you're working with, either the attorneys or the judges, are meteorological experts. So I imagine that a good part of your job is educating. And what are some of the techniques that you use to kind of communicate some of these more complex topics to judges, juries, and your own attorney?
Sure. Well, I think my teaching background also has a little bit of help with that. So I'm also an adjunct professor of meteorology at Keane University, where I graduated from, and teaching the intro to meteorology class to hundreds of students over the years has really opened my eyes as a professor with that one-on-one interaction to see, okay, where is the general public's, starting point and overall knowledge of a certain subject, and how could I make it understandable and digestible to them, because the last thing I want to do is throw facts and figures and acronyms and really technically scientific things that bore you to death like a scientific paper, and just make it something that's, like I said, digestible and something that they could even apply to their daily lives. I think one of my favorite, and one of my students' favorite lab activities is to everyone take out their phones and look at the weather for the particular location. And every app uses a slightly different technique or algorithm to forecast and predict the weather, even for right now. Because most times when you ask your phone or your digital assistant what the weather is, it's reading from a weather model that was run 6 to 8 hours ago that grabbed weather balloon data 12 hours before that. So it's pretty old. And a lot of times it doesn't align with the actual forecast of what's happening outside your window. So, I made sure that my classroom had the shades rolled up, you had a full view of the sky, and we would look out and we would say, okay, is your phone accurately representing what the weather is outside? And a lot of times it was not. And I think that was really eye-opening to, like, this is how the weather changes so rapidly, and here's why. And once the students understood the why, it really got them intrigued. And I think that's how I've intrigued a lot of my hiring parties and the attorneys that I work with, that, oh, wow, there really is a lot more than just, the phrase that you, you work all this time, and I wish I could be wrong every day and still get paid, that sort of thing that you hear about meteorologists.
You indicated that you've done work for both the plaintiff and the defendant side. Do you find that there is a significant difference in the way you approach those different types of engagements?
So it's my job to provide the facts, and I will all if there's any information or evidence that I discover that could potentially hurt the side that hired me, it would be in my best interest to, kind of advise over the phone. And I think that was one of my initial mistakes, when I was just starting out. I mean, WeatherPrep, my company, is 10 years old this year. So I've had many dozens of cases over the years. But in the very beginning, I wish I knew that you really have to be um, over the phone with clients and the hiring parties exclusively until you come to sort of an agreement of what should be stated and what should be said in the report. Because with giving information that could almost hand the entire case over to the opposite party, obviously is not in anyone's best interest. And once it's in paper and once it's published, and even though I title everything attorney work product in emails, it still could be pretty detrimental. So that would be my initial, what's something I could have done better, and what's something I knew when I first started out, but not putting things in writing so quickly.
On the topic of that, on report writing in general, what's your strategy? How do you go about formatting your reports? Do you typically get some kind of an outline from the attorneys, or are you writing whole cloth?
So a lot of times it will be in the initial consultation, what do you want out of me? Because the last thing I want to do is spend 10 hours of billable time giving the attorney fluff that is useless to their case. It's not in anybody's best interest. So if I could make it that, we need to get from point A to point F, and we do B, C, D, E in between, highlighting those points to get to that, take that walk. I want to do it in the most efficient and time, effective way possible. Also for a cost savings perspective, because this second question, a lot of times I will have on an introductory call is, what's the real cost of a final report? I have some questions here on the fee schedule, and it really depends. Certain attorneys just want the initial short, give me the main points, and I want to keep this as inexpensive as possible. And others, after my initial 10 to 15 page analysis with maps and charts and data, will say, I want to focus more on this point, or I'd like to focus more on this point. Can you break out and give more detail about the time around the incident? Because I think that's really going to help the case. And so that, understanding that just they literally asked me to do more billable hours and there's going to be a higher expense. But if it helps their case and maybe can even avoid a trial by going to summary judgment and, and being positive for the client in general, that will be the deal. So it is customizable. I would say it takes into account the goal and the strategy of each hiring party, but overall, I'm willing to do whatever it takes and kind of work through the problem to make sure there's enough hard evidence there and make the case stronger for the client.
When you're writing a report, there's a couple distinct types of reports. There's your initial reports and your rebuttal reports. Is there any difference in the way that you approach those two types of reports, besides the obvious, which is a rebuttal report's a little easier because it comes, already done for you? But do you approach the problem any differently?
So I know that the listeners can't see my face, but I'm turning red, laughing hard while you were asking the question, because this happens quite often, and it's the fact that, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of new meteorologists entering the space, and they don't necessarily have the tools or the toolkit or the experience, to know what's acceptable and what's not. I have in the past destroyed the opposing experts' report to the point where the rebuttal was longer than my initial report, because it had so many holes I had to plug and point out. A lot of it relates to the continuing education aspect, because so I found in rebuttal specifically issues with the young newbies meteorologists that maybe just got their seal or don't have one yet. Or there's also, because I presume it would be for either an expense purpose, because maybe they don't charge as much, or the really experienced but retired / emeritus meteorologist that doesn't keep up with the continuing education and maybe hasn't been to a weather conference in several years / decades, and there's new technology, new information, and new weather warning techniques out there, specifically in the space of slip and falls with snow and ice. And so there was recently a report that I rebutted that completely omitted the new snow squall weather warning, which only came out a few years ago. And it really helped our case that it was left out, but kind of in pointing it out, there's ways of doing it tactfully, but there's also ways of kind of like, how did you miss this? Like, it was so glaring, and it's right there, it's public data. And so that's kind of been fun to be like, hey, like, you really messed up. Maybe you should probably know about this. But there's also been rebuttals that I've received from the opposing expert, and they've been so nitpicky and kind of with little superfluous things that the hiring party that hired me to do a great report was like, wow, you really covered all your bases, because this other expert can't find a single hole in your paper. He's taking one sentence you wrote and turning it around, which still gets to the same answer, but he just says a different way because there's nothing else to rebut. So those are, kind of like the win moments where you get excited because you did a really good job and you were very thorough, that your peer review essentially passed the test.
So we're at a point, you've written your report, let's say that it's going to deposition or even going to trial. How do you control yourself when you're being peppered with lots of questions? How do you maintain your demeanor? What are your suggestions and techniques that you use just in general to present yourself as an authoritative person, a relatable person, and somebody that the judge, the jury, whoever's deposing you can trust?
So in my experience, it's been sort of an act, especially when you're being deposed or you're on the stand. Uh, Being tactful is important. Not losing your cool, obviously, is first and foremost. But I think providing the correct and most concise answer, in an educated and not in a delivery that's not like talking down to someone, makes the jury feel relatable. The last thing I would want to come out and portray is somebody who goes up there with his nose held high, like I know what I'm talking about, and what I say is, the gold standard, etc. It's more so the fine balance of all of the above.
Is that something that needs to be trained? Is that something you develop, or is that something that you have to have at the outset?
So that's an excellent question because I relate it back to my time in broadcasting. I was always told that it's a talent that you have to have in order to be, an on-air personality. In the sense of being an expert in depositions or on the stand, there is some talent that is innate that allows someone to do an excellent job. Some can be learned, but a lot of it is talent. And I've had dozens of interns over the years that were students of mine when I was in broadcasting that wanted to be like the next on-air personality, wanted to be and grow up after college to be the next Al Roker or Sam Champion. And a lot of times it really doesn't work out for them because they don't have that innate talent as much as they practice and as hard as they try and as much work they put into it, and eventually they give up. But I relate it to that. I think that in order to be an excellent expert witness and write the paper and be the scientist, there's also a just as important trait of having that innate ability to present in person, in a deposition or on the stand, because that can really help or hurt a case.
You mentioned earlier how important it is to have continuing education because you never know when you're going to face some new technology or something that may be brought up in a case. On a similar token, how important is it to have, obviously you did not have this benefit when you were first getting started, but how important is it to be able to pay it forward and to help new, say in your case, meteorologists, but it can be generalized to any type of expertise, to have somebody kind of show you the ropes and bring you up?
Sure. So I think for starters, when I was beginning in this area, one of my first big cases, I would send my report to another meteorologist that I knew that was up and coming in the space, not necessarily in consulting. He stayed more in broadcasting, but just an idea of, hey, can you look this over? Can you give me an idea if I missed anything or if I omitted anything? Just kind of another perspective and kind of check my work, if you will. There have been other instances where new younger meteorologists have wanted to break into the space, and I'm in two of them, for instance, I've been more than happy to, assist them as much as possible without divulging all the secrets, if you will. So yeah, it's important for the friendly competition because there are older retiring meteorologists that will ultimately need to be replaced. But at the same time, there are enough meteorologists out there working for individual firms that there have been a lot of conflicts recently. And that's how I tend to get some of my work. A hiring attorney would go to an expert firm and say, hey, can you help out with this case? But that firm already represents one of the parties in another capacity, whether it be weather forecasting or et cetera. So to have more of those meteorologists in the pool, I think will keep the environment pretty healthy.
As a broadcast veteran, one of the things that is pretty common, especially for meteorologists, is to liven it up with a little bit of levity, a couple jokes. How appropriate is that in a courtroom setting? Is there room for levity, for a little bit of lightness, for the occasional joke, or does it have to remain incredibly serious throughout the process?
So I haven't found the opportunity yet, at least in depositions, because you look at it this way: most of the cases are pretty serious. They involve near death or permanent dismemberment, or things that are, at least in the cases I've worked on, required pain and suffering, and so it's hard to provide levity in that case. Now, I would say, in my best advice, in any realm, it's always important to just read the room. If there is a judge, for instance, that wants to keep a certain part light, or maybe even makes the first joke and tries to lighten the mood a little bit, that would make more sense to, again, help gain that relatability. But I would say to err on the side of caution and kind of not be the first to enter that space. I did it once. I was giving a professional talk, and I started the talk. They say if you're speaking to and orating to a large room, maybe start with a little joke and see where it goes. Yeah, well, this joke did not go over well, and it was just silence, pin drop. And I'm like, okay, guess we're not doing that. So, yeah, in my experience, it would always be best to let somebody else set the tone.
One thing that I hear from a lot of expert witnesses is that your duty is not to the client, but it's to the truth. What is the role, to your view, of neutrality in expert witnessing?
I would say neutrality is key. It is super important because there have been less than 3 cases of mine where the hiring party has asked me to do something. And in my mind, I'm thinking, take a hike. Like, I don't even want to work with you anymore. If you're asking me to go under oath and sign an affidavit and put this in writing of something that I don't necessarily think I could defend. So, and those are the ones that I kind of think after the fact, like, lose my number. Like, don't call me again. I don't need this stress. If I'm not the hired gun, if that's what you're looking for, I'm going to give you the truth. And if there is information that comes to light that could hurt you, yeah, I won't put it in writing. But be prepared when the other expert finds it, and we're going to have to come up with some sort of answer. So neutrality is absolutely key, while remembering that you are working for someone, so it's your best interest to, find the facts that relate to facts that would help them.
Before we wrap up, do you have any last advice for newer expert witnesses in particular, or attorneys that are working with expert witnesses?
I would say to be yourself, especially in the initial consultation. Yes, stay professional, but some of the cases that I've received just from the initial call was, you're so relatable that the attorney is like, oh my gosh, I love you so much. I'm canceling the other appointments and interviews I had this afternoon. I want you. And I was like, wow, that was easy. So I think being yourself and showing the personality and of course your expertise and what you can do really makes it a good attorney-client relationship in the term of your expert work, because that has worked for me, and I'm sure it's something that could work for many.
Mr. Favetta, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks, Noah. Great to be here.
And thank you to our audience for joining me for another discussion at the Roundtable. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.